This mini lecture is on another form of market structure or market organization called monopsony. Similar to monopoly, where there is a single seller of the product, a monopsony is a market with a single buyer, and it's another alternative or another extreme to the other market structures we've studied to this point, those being a perfectly competitive market and the monopolistic competition and oligopoly markets, which are not so extreme. So here we've got a picture of a labor market with wage as the vertical axis or the price variable and the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis. Now, if this was a monopolized labor market, then you would have a single seller of the product or the resource, labor, and the single seller has some price making abilities then, meaning that they can choose to be anywhere along the demand curve above or left of the equilibrium up here, and they could set the price higher if they wanted to maximize their own, I guess it wouldn't be profits, it would be income here or their wages. And by doing that, they would have to restrict the quantity sold. To make that decision, they compare the additional revenue, or here it would be income in the labor market, that they earn from selling an additional unit of their labor, and they compare that to the marginal cost of selling it, and in the labor market that would be the value of their time. So we would draw a marginal revenue curve or a marginal income curve that would look something like this. And we know that to maximize a seller's profit, or something like a producer's surplus, they would look for that intersection point where marginal revenue or marginal income crosses the marginal cost curve. That would be this point right here. And then they would choose the price according to the demand curve, and that would be that price and quantity combination up there. An example of this could be a single seller of a very exclusive or a specialized type of labor, such as a professional athlete or maybe a top-tier premier actor. Another example could be a union, similar to a cartel in an oligopoly market, where a bunch of firms or sellers get together and act like they're a single seller. In an oligopoly market, we would call that a cartel. And in a labor market, we would call that the extreme case of a union, where there are no other sellers of the labor in the industry. Now contrast that to a monopsony in the labor market. And as we go through this exercise, look for the similarities in the thought process of marginal analysis, comparing the marginal good thing versus the marginal bad thing. In the labor market here, I've labeled our two curves. We know that the supply curve is essentially a marginal cost or a cost of time. And we know that the demand for labor has a special name, either called the value of the marginal product or sometimes called the marginal revenue product. It's the value of the additional output produced by each additional worker. Now, because we've got a monopsony, or a single buyer, that means that our buyer, which would be the firms in this case, have the ability to choose any point along the seller's curve below or to the left of the equilibrium if they would like to sell fewer units in order to get a lower price, to maximize something like the buyer's surplus or the employer's surplus. Now remember that if this is a monopolized market, the marginal revenue curve is downward sloping, because if the seller wants to sell one additional unit, they have to cut the price on all units to be able to attract that additional buyer. Therefore, similarly, when the single buyer, this is monopsony, the single buyer of the product wants to buy one additional unit, they would have to move up along the supply curve. And as they do that, they have to both hire additional workers and they have to increase the wage paid for every worker. And it's because of both of those effects combined that the additional dollars that they pay to hire each additional worker increases very quickly. And we get what we'll call a marginal factor cost. That is the additional cost to hire one more unit of the factor of production, or the product being bought and sold here. And this is a relatively high number, and it's also increasing very quickly. If you wanted to draw this graphically, it would be a box or a rectangle drawn over to the supply curve, and the area of that box increases very quickly. The rate at which that box increases is what the marginal factor cost curve is representing. Now, our single buyer was looking for a point that maximizes their buyer's surplus, or buyer's happiness, or something like the buyer's excess benefit from their purchases. Somewhere here there's going to be a point where the additional cost to hire workers is no longer covered by the additional value or the additional revenue produced by that worker's output. And we see that that intersection point is right here. Think briefly about the similarity to that intersection point with the monopolized picture, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that intersection point will define the best quantity of labor to hire. And then, much like the monopoly picture, the price that they choose is going to be the one on the supply curve that corresponds to that quantity of labor. So one more time, look for the parallels between the monopolized industry and the monopsonized industry. When there is a single seller in a monopoly, they can choose any point along the buyer's demand curve, and they'll choose the one where the marginal benefit, or the marginal revenue, is just offset by the marginal cost of additional units. In a monopsonized market with a single buyer, they can choose any point along the seller's supply curve, and their optimal point is the one where, again, the marginal benefit, here the revenue produced by the additional worker, exactly offsets the marginal cost of hiring the additional worker, and we find that that defines the optimal quantity to buy, and they will buy them at the price indicated on the supply curve. This is our last example in our textbook of a industry structure. So we've got a couple different cases now. We've got perfectly competitive markets where neither the buyer nor the seller has any price-making power. They're both price takers. We also have the monopolized market, which is the extreme case with only one seller. We have the monopsonized market, where there is the extreme case of only one buyer. And then we also have a couple of imperfectly competitive markets, those being monopolistic competition and oligopoly. With that combination, we really have a set of pretty powerful tools here to try to model or represent just about any market structure that we could think of, or at least get a starting point for how to represent any specific case study market out there that we might want to take a look at.